Are we ready to go back, Dr. Melton, to Mr. Zuba?
Yes, sir, we are ready. We're going to actually connect via phone with Mr. Zuba and Mr. Gallagher. And Sydney, if you could pull the slideshow up while Ms. Price is connecting via phone. Dr. Harris, for the if you'll reintroduce this just to make sure that we get our minds back focused on this purpose as we get Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Zuba connected. If you'll reintroduce this item so that we can make sure that we connect with responsibility what we're about to present.
Absolutely. Take two. This is Mr. Mike Gallagher, Mr. Mike Zuba and Patrick Gallagher, I'm sorry, of Malone and McBroom Incorporated, who have been working dutifully and diligently to provide us a instrument regarding redistricting and information and insight and update at this time regarding updates to that process since we met last in July. Mr. Zuba and Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. If we can do a sound check, Mr. Zuba.
Sound check.
Let's try one more time.
Sound check. Hello? Hello?
Great, much better. Mr. Gallagher, if you'll do a sound check for me, please. We're not connecting with Mr. Gallagher yet.
So, Mr. Zuba, are you prepared to do the entire presentation? I apologize, Mr. All right, let's continue on.
That's quite all right. We're prepared to roll forward. It's exciting to learn a little bit of history about the elementary school 13, now Piney Woods neighborhood. So we'll be happy to update all of our information going forward with that, because it was a little awkward for us calling it elementary school 13 as well. Moving ahead to our second slide. I know it's a tough time now for all the community. There's a lot of survey fatigue. We are thrilled to report that as our community survey for our redistricting ran for about 2 weeks, we had just over 7,660 responses. Kudos to everybody who chimed in, got involved as part of the process. This is just the start of it, and we're taking this information and it will be rolled into what we're going to talk about a little later, which is the guiding criterion where Pat and I really get to roll our sleeves up and begin that redistricting process of forming those attendance zones. Next slide, please. So when we surveyed all of the respondents and asked their interest in the project and process, overwhelmingly we got a large parent response, which isn't a surprise for one of this nature at 85%. I will note that parents and respondents were able to pick several categories. We did get a fairly strong student response as well of just under 1,400, and then residents or community at large comprised the other portion of our survey respondents. Next slide.
Thanks, Mike. Over.
When we looked at a geographic location for those survey respondents, what we want to be able to do is be able to cross-tabulate some of this information, which we did, and we'll present a summary of that. Just what attendance zone or what neighborhood do you associate with? By and large, no coincidence with where the school construction is occurring. The largest percent of our respondents were from Lake Murray, as well as the Chapin attendance zones, with lower participation as we worked our way into the Irmo cluster as you moved east across the district. Next slide. And then we wanted to get an understanding of, and hearing more about the history of it, just how long in the community have you been at this location? 46% of our respondents lived at their current address for less than 5 years. We had another 33% have lived at their address for more than 10 years. So we had both new arrivals as well as those that have been invested in the community and lived there for a long time. So really balanced across the board. So next was really asking about the students. We want to get a good understanding of, do you have students who will be attending, District 5 schools and who will attend it for the upcoming year. 86% have students who will be attending District 5 this year. That's pretty consistent with what we see when we conduct these surveys. It's really getting into the parent community, showing a strong involvement there, and kudos for those that are chimed in as part of that. Next slide. So wondering about getting some information about those students, looking at what school exactly which school they will attend the upcoming year. As I mentioned overall earlier, we had a large response. The closer we were to the Chapin cluster, we're seeing very similar to that at all the different grade levels. About 54% of our respondents have children who will attend an elementary school. This is largely going to be an elementary school redistricting. We do know that there could be potential for impacts as you roll up through those grade levels. So we're looking across the board, and we have about 40% that participated in our survey are having elementary or intermediate as well as middle school students, and about 50% those attending high school. And then across the board, we have a higher participation by those within the Chapin cluster. Next slide. So as we presented back in mid-July, we talked about having draft criteria, and that being the roadmap for really our redistricting as we get into not only the decision-making, but how we begin to prioritize some of the goals for the district and for the Board of Trustees. So what we wanted to do was to be able to look at those draft criteria, be able to get input from the community on those, and this is just the community-wide prioritization of it. When we put out there minimize disruptions to students and families, that came in as the most important criteria. Second most important criteria was maintaining that geographic distribution. And the third, it was balancing enrollment across all schools. We had pretty good response for all 6 of those criteria. The one that had the least important, but is one that is kind of a given, it's to develop an attendance zone for elementary school 13 or Piney Woods Elementary School. I think that's probably one of the reasons why it fell down the list a little bit more. It was just assumed that it would be done overall. Next slide. When we wanted to break it down by our various clusters and taking a look at what the level of importance there. So within the Chapin cluster, addressing the overclouding there, was one of the highest scores overall for our guiding criteria, and that's no surprise considering those have been, largely the members of the community that have been following the construction and impacted by the overcrowding that has been there. Develop an attendance zone really struck probably right in the middle across the board with all respondents, with a little bit higher score for the Chapin cluster. Balancing enrollments was important across the board. It was also very important within the Irmo cluster itself, looking at a way to be able to have balanced enrollments in a very equitable use of facilities. And then looking at maintaining geographic proximity, it was one of our highest scores, or second overall, and it was also highly scored in the Chapin cluster as well as the other clusters. Next slide. So as we begin to look at those criteria, really, looking at them by grade, we had similar trends across all grade groupings. So what was valued overall, by and large across the district, was also pretty well split up, whether you were in an elementary school, an intermediate school, or in a high school. Next. So then we asked a bunch of open-ended questions, and we did get a large variety of responses. What we tried to do was be able to group those nearly 1,000 unique responses into common, really families of responses in order to help kind of shape what we're doing and point out areas of, areas of either opportunities or areas of concern. So what was really our most responded to in those open-ended questions were talking about transportation and proximity, maintaining the bus and travel times, getting back into that theme of equity and inclusion, improving diversity across the schools, ensuring that there is ample space for equitable distribution of resources, and then talking about the potential for grandfathering current students and siblings, and that's something that'll come into consideration, or at least for discussion later in the process. One of the ones that jumped out to us was just school choice and magnet programming. That's where we've taken that input and sort of put it into rather than a grading criteria, making it just part of it, that it jumps off the page, and that's something that's just going to continue under what the current programming is and not be subject to change as part of the redistricting. And then really, onto the next slide. Some of the other ones were enrollment balancing, and I think the key part of that was just, eliminating the enrollment freeze, looking at, a more long-term solution rather than some of the temporary measures, whether it be a portable classroom, and looking at ways to be able to balance it across the board and to free up some of that excess space to provide, educational growth opportunities, improving equity and socioeconomics, getting back to that theme of, having equitable resources across the district, and then attendance zones, improving proximity and travel times. We got a lot of feedback on individual neighborhoods as we get into crafting the boundaries and the different options. That's something that Pat and I are going to look back on and help identify if there's any opportunities there or any areas of concern there based on that direct feedback we got from the community. Next slide. We asked another question on challenges. With any redistricting, it's change and disruption associated with it. I've been doing redistricting for a long time, and that's always, something that we're very cognizant of. And as you'll see when we begin crafting these options and putting them out there, it's a constant balance there. We're striving for certain criteria while also minimizing disruption. A challenge in getting public support for the recommended plan. I feel we're off to a good start there with over 7,600 respondents. It's important that the community is sort of tracking the progress of this as we move forward, and I'll talk about it a little later. We're going to put out the digital tools there for everybody to be engaged and everybody to get us the feedback on these options. So we're hoping that community support will grow over time. And then fairness, looking at in both terms of process and redistricting, always a challenge. It's always, done through a consultant like my Lona McBroom with Pat and I. We look at it as a data-driven process. We put that lens on of, looking at those guiding criteria and deliver a best planning program that's going to be sustainable as well as best meet your needs. And that really ties into our last bullet point there on the challenge. For each one of these options, we're looking at the long-term enrollment projections, ensuring that, these attendance zones are going to be able to withstand the test of time. So it's something that's very important, and to Pat and I, is that we have long-lasting boundaries for school redistricting. So we left off at the last presentation talking about draft guiding criteria. And in looking at the guiding criteria, they really do present this community, board, administration, all of District 5's priorities of what do you want to be able to accomplish at the end of the day as part of this process. It also provides Pat and I input on what's your values, what's important to you, and gives us some grounding and some roadmap to be able to follow as we're going through these options. And, it becomes almost the opportunity to be able to create new boundaries, be able to see what that looks like from an attendance zone while still being able to sort of navigate, what are those historic neighborhoods. But overall, at a bare minimum, any redistricting needs to be able to align with the projected enrollments. It will need to align with your facilities, utilization, and capacity, and it needs to be able to maintain the hard work that you've put in on your current choice and magnet programs, so to be able to facilitate and allow those programs to continue at where they're at and to be able to grow as your needs grow in the future. Our primary criteria are those that really need to be met for all redistricting options. It's something that, we really strive for, we strictly adhere to. The main part of it is looking at being able to address the long-term overcrowding at Chapin Cluster, as well as to provide that long-term enrollment growth in the area. You have to have an established elementary school attendance zone for the Piney Woods Elementary School. That's going to be a major outcome of that, as well as having that attendance zone be able to support future growth. And then equally important, there's no order of importance between bullets 1, 2, and 3. It's balancing enrollment across all school buildings. As we went through our study, we identified some buildings and really confirmed what we were hearing, that some buildings were highly utilized and some had some space. So looking at the disparities in utilization across the board, we want to ensure that we're having it spread out equitably, that all schools have an opportunity to be able to take on additional growth or deploy additional programmatic space as needed in the future. Our secondary criteria are those that we're striving for. Even though we did hear the importance of maintaining geographic proximity, sometimes when you're trying to maintain geographic proximity and strive for effective utilization and balanced utilization, there's going to be a little give and take there where one may have to give a little bit to be able to accomplish the other, and that's some of the items we'll talk a little bit later on in the program. Maintain the existing cluster model and feeder pattern, so we're going to strive to be able to keep those in place, and overall minimize disruption to students and families. With any redistricting, there will be some change, there will be some movement. It's looking at how best to be able to balance that impact while still being able to achieve what we found was important to the community as well as important to the board. So to really summarize and wrap up, before we talk about our next steps, we are fully through our data analysis phase. We've analyzed and presented our trends, which include our enrollment projections as well as what that future growth looks like out at a neighborhood level, out 10 years. Took stock in where you were at with facility space, identified your enrollment targets for each school facility, so have a good understanding of where we can be able to have some movement of students as well as what the new elementary school can hold from an enrollment standpoint. And then really about a month ago began that community engagement. So we're hopeful now with that community engagement platform. We have many of those in the community on board. You can be able to follow us along in the process. It's not going to be a tremendous lift. We want to make it as easy as possible for all families involved, knowing that there's a lot going on right now and that there's an information overload. So really give you the most salient points of information, allow you to be able to communicate effectively with us, and for us to be able to listen as we work our way through creating what the various attendance zones could look like in your district. Next slide. So as we work our way through this fall, now that we have the guiding criteria in place, we're going to be putting out 5 potential options. And as I discussed a little bit earlier, at least gave some hints towards, those options are going to be looking at being able to meet what the community gave us as part of their values as really cemented into that guiding criteria. And with that, Pat and I will come back and talk about really the pros and cons and considerations of each option as we put it together, looking at the neighborhood impact, looking at the student movement impact, talking about what it does from a space standpoint, talking about maybe what it doesn't do from, say, one of our other, our balancing standpoint, and really work with you to be able to look at those options and be able to put forward a recommended plan that really best suits the needs of the district with that long-term view in mind. So the whole while we're looking at it, it's not just under the lens of who's there right now, it's really looking at it under the lens of that 10-year window to ensure that as these boundaries are going to perform at least out for the foreseeable future, and that there won't be any changes after this plan, knowing what it's like to go through a redistricting plan. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the Board of Trustees to see if they have any questions on any of the information that I presented tonight.
Dr. Moulton, did you have anything before we entertain questions?
Yes, sir. I would like to add on that last slide, and Sydney, if you'll pull that back up for full screen so that our participants can see, and of course that our board can have access to this. When Dr. Harris and I have talked with Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher, the bandwidth that's going to be necessary, we've got to work in cooperation with our technology team. You all know me well enough to know that I prefer specific timelines to make sure that we're on pace. But because of the bandwidth that this is going to require, I cannot compromise the success of 5 or a hybrid model. So because of the estimations that Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Zuba have, we've got to work in conjunction with technology to make sure that our instructional program can continue to work or start up successfully for our reentry so that this process does not compromise what we need to do academically. It's important that I situate this within context for our administrative world because so often people don't understand the elements that we're working with. Choice timeline is still intact that we consistently have. Our staffing timelines are still intact that we typically have. And of course, add the layer of transportation. Mr. Wiseman, of course, is here. He's got to have time to make sure that this is properly prepared to get ready for the coming academic year. So those are pieces of this puzzle that you don't necessarily see. But I thought it was important that I pause to explain that piece of information as to why you don't see the specifics here. Unfortunately, we've experienced tonight how technology can be disruptive. And because it can be disruptive, I cannot have technology interfere with the mission and the core purpose of this district, of that being instruction and achievement for our students. Mr. Cates will pause for any questions that the board may have. This, of course, is the second item from the superintendent's report requiring no action this evening. This is for information.
Questions for Dr. Melton? Ms. Hammond.
Before I ask my question, Dr. Milton, thank you for the statement you just made about, because I can tell you as a teacher, that can happen to your child while teaching's going on technology. So I appreciate that you don't want to overwork our Wi-Fi. My question to the presenters, with this study, should there be any tie-in to our facility study that we had from NBCon a few, I guess now months ago, where we looked at the needs, the facility needs, and then, but we also are looking at where there'll be children, it might help us in knowing whether we should renovate a school or on one end where we've lost enrollment and we could use one school. I just thought when I saw that I would like for them to see that, Dr. Milton.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question and the opportunity. Mr. Zuba likely will engage with this response. The facility study is one of the artifacts that Dr. Harris passed along to Mr. Zuba and Mr. Gallagher for them to review as they work towards this. Of course, that's not going to necessarily guide this work, but it does complement the work to have as another piece of information. Mr. Zuba, anything you'd like to add beyond the fact that you've used this as a piece of complementary materials?
No, I think you're right. We did use it as a piece of complementary material. We want them to be able to take a look at the key pieces of information that inform what we're doing, especially those that they're related to, capacity overall or enrollment targets and how the building operates, to be able to get a good understanding of it. So we're just not really working in a vacuum, and we're building off of that work. We have to have a good understanding of what the facilities are themselves as we begin to populate students through them.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, thank you, Dr. Melton and Mr. Zuba, Mr. Gallagher. Thank you for your patience as we work through that. Technology can be disruptive, but it also, we had options, so we were able to exercise our options, and thank you to our technology staff for getting y'all patched here on the phone. And I hate to tell you, but I'm going to hang up on you if I can. Thank you, guys.
All right. You're welcome.
Mr. Cates, that concludes the superintendent's report.